Hello there and welcome. This is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file, coming to you live from Algiers with me, Karim Fazakari. Here's what's on tap today. It's the war that was both eminently predictable and roundly unpredicted. If ever there has been a conflict that underscored the urgent need in the policy world for strategic foresight, it's the one currently raging in Ukraine. For months, foresight experts have been projecting how the war could break out and, once it did, how it could unfold next. Several factors suggested it was turning in the West's favor, including popular international support for Ukraine, Kiev's determination to fight, and newfound transatlantic solidarity. Since then, Russia's initial offensive has collapsed. Transatlantic allies and partners have become bolder in their action, and NATO appears poised to admit Finland and Sweden. 4 months later, it's important to revisit the thinking. Foresight is a strategic exercise that requires returning to the original evidence. The assumptions and scenarios should be modified in accordance with the actual events. If the scenarios are built on faulty assumptions, or if they are poorly or calibrated to events on the ground, they will not be useful for policymakers seeking to develop coherent strategies. So in this special show, we'll try to re-examine some original scenarios in light of new developments in Ukraine. For that, I am joined live via Skype by Peter Milutinovic, Institute of European Studies from Serbia, along with Stephen Hall, lecturer and assistant professor in politics, international relations at University of Bath from England. Thank you, gentlemen, for accepting to be with us. The discussion right after this. And before we get down to any debate, let's have the updates. A Russian ammunition depot was apparently targeted by Ukrainian forces overnight, resulting in a massive blast. The Ukrainian military southern command said the rocket strike targeted the depot in Russian-held Nova Kakhovka, east of the important Black Sea port city of Kherson, also occupied by Russian forces. Russian state news agency TASS said that at least 7 people were killed in the attack. So let's kick it off with you, Mr. Petar Milutinovic. Russian officials say that the nature of the strike suggested that Ukraine forces used US-supplied multiple-launch high-mobility artillery rocket systems to strike the area. Can we say here that the West is blamed for this attack? And how are we expecting Russia's reaction to this assault? Any possible escalation?
First of all, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Ukraine's government indicated in recent days that it might launch a counteroffensive to reclaim its territory in the south, as Russia devotes resources to capturing all of the eastern Donbas region. Russia's TASS news agency offered a different account of the blast, saying a mineral fertilizer storage facility exploded actually, and that a market, hospital, and houses were damaged in the strike. Some of the ingredients in fertilizer can be used actually for ammunition. So when there is a full-scale war that has been waging on for 130 plus days, every object can be used for military purposes and can be actually seen as a legitimate military target. It is unknown whether these 7 people which are killed are military personnel or civilians. But from the onset of the war, Ukraine emerged victorious actually in defending Kiev, Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, being of course entirely dependent on the US and EU for heavy weapons, ammunition, gasoline, humanitarian and budgetary support. So yet Russia, despite suffering heavy losses, has managed to occupy around 20% of Ukraine's territory and cut off Ukraine's access to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, with devastating economic effects, reducing the export of Ukrainian agricultural products. Ukraine's grain exports, for example, had nearly halved year on year in early June. Currently, Russia is leveraging its relative artillery and air superiority to make incremental gains across the Donbas region, especially now during the second phase of the war. If Ukraine can halt Russia's offensive in Donbas, it would deprive Moscow of a strategic victory. Yet the Russian occupation of territory and the current destructive war of attrition have proven to be costly for Ukraine. Despite the mounting expenses for Moscow in both blood and treasure, the ability of Russia to strangle Ukraine's economy remains an alarming concern. Kiev's objective rather aims at winning the war and mobilizing Western support to this end.
Very nice indeed. And what about you, Professor Stephen Hall? Russia's TASS agency, as our distinguished guest just referred to, offered a different account, saying that the largest or the target was a mineral fertilizer storage facility that exploded and that a market, hospital and houses were damaged. Some of the ingredients in fertilizers can be used for ammunition. Since the region is controlled by Russia, does the attack harm Ukraine as well, according to you?
Well, I would say that obviously Russia will have a different view as to what actually occurred and what was targeted in terms of the mineral fertilizer plant. And of course, they would mention that a hospital or civilians were harmed in some way. In some respects, if that narrative is true, then of course it does harm Ukraine to an extent. But Ukraine was quite clear in terms of its leadership saying recently as well that it's best that civilians leave the occupied areas if they can, because there is going to be an offensive. Whether that offensive is now is unlikely. I think it's coming. So it certainly is the case that I think that Ukraine has been very good in terms of its intelligence at targeting depots, munitions depots. Of course, Russia would have a different, or try to show a different opinion within its narrative. So I don't think it harms Ukraine certainly within a Western audience, and I would say within a Ukrainian audience domestically as well.
Very nice indeed. Back to you, Mr. Pitar Militonovich. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zlenesky on Monday met with visiting Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte to discuss financial and military support for Kiev. Does this mean Ukraine's strategy here excludes any possibility to resolve the issue through diplomatic negotiations?
President Zelensky, in any peace negotiations, will be actually constrained by a society distraught by human loss and grave destruction. So it seems to me that ceding territory is off the table. Moscow has also recently proclaimed that occupied territories are not up for negotiation, rendering all talks pointless from Kiev's perspective. United States and EU support for Ukraine remains resolute overall, as demonstrated actually by the broad denunciation of Henry Kissinger's Davos statement calling for Ukraine to cede territory. Western Europe, of course, remains cautious, however, about Ukraine's prospects for a complete military victory, which means retaking all lost territory. But regardless of the immediate war outcome, the current situation and trends point to a de facto partition. Ukraine could face continued Russian strikes on its territory and/or sea blockage long into the future. Meanwhile, Russia has endured the immediate impact of unprecedented Western sanctions, while the numerous sanction packages are detrimentally affecting the Russian economy and hindering its future growth. The oil embargo has also further exacerbated already steep energy prices and broader inflation in Europe. But the time of the conflict is staggering in its global economic impact. The invasion, coupled with the Western sanctions, has magnified the COVID-related downturn in the global economy. The world actually could be entering a period of stagflation that might have severe consequences for middle and low-income economies alike. A looming global food crisis and any insecurity that may accompany it are particularly paramount. The preparations for the negotiations actually should be therefore ongoing, and the negotiations should end the war. The negotiations to end the war should take place if ever that opportunity emerges. Crucial elements for a viable peace process already are visible: direct United States and European participation in specific talks, and a peacekeeping mission to prevent Russia's consolidation of control over contested Ukrainian territories. But Western governments are actually unified in declaring that any negotiation will be done by the Ukrainians based on their own needs and their own timetable.
Very clear. And speaking of energy, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zlenesky condemned Canada on Monday for allowing the delivery of a gas turbine to Germany in order to help resolve technical concerns with the Nord Stream 1 pipeline that were mentioned by a Russian energy provider.
First, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had to summon Canada's representative to our country due to an absolute and acceptable exception to the sanctions regime against Russia. This is not just about the turbine for the Nord Stream gas pipeline, which Canada was not supposed to but nevertheless decided to transfer actually to Russia. This is about general rules of sanctions. If a terrorist state can squeeze out such an exception to sanctions, what exceptions will it want tomorrow or the day after tomorrow? This question is very dangerous. Moreover, it is dangerous not only to Ukraine, but also for countries of the democratic world.
Back to you, Professor Stephen Hall. Zelensky said he had summoned Canada's ambassador to the country for discussions due to the absolutely unacceptable exception to the sanctions regime against Russia. What's your reading on this? Here we see that Western, let's say, interest is always first.
I think certainly you can argue that Western interest is always first. I think that Germany would have spoken to Canada and America and said that this is harming our economy, we are unprepared for the coming winter, and we'll see whether Gazprom actually follows through in providing more gas through Nord Stream 1. But I think that there was certainly, I think Russia miscalculated as well, effectively blackmailing Germany. Germany will now make the decision, yes, it will get its gas, we'll see whether Gazprom actually follows through on that, but Germany is now more intransigent in trying to find a peace solution between Russia and Ukraine, is my interpretation. And we could actually start seeing Germany increasing its support, and probably will see Germany increasing its support to Ukraine in terms of military support and humanitarian aid. So I think that Russia has miscalculated. Germany, of course, historically was a relatively close, I don't want to say ally, but a relatively close country in terms of its support for Russia. And Russia has now effectively tried to blackmail it, which you just don't do if you want to try and find a solution and you want to keep Germany on side because of its power within Europe to get other EU countries to do what Germany thinks is best. So, yes, of course, Canada has possibly overstepped the line, but I think we'll actually see an increase in support militarily for Ukraine, both from Canada and from Germany. And Germany will distance itself even further from Russia.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Peter Militonovich? German officials are suspicious about Russia's intentions, particularly after Russia's Gazprom last month reduced the gas flow through Nord Stream 1 by 60%. Is this, or is it possible that Russia is not going to resume the flow of gas as scheduled? And perhaps just to let Western countries taste a little bit of what it means to do without Russian energy products?
Quite predictable. The EU finally agreed to ban most imports of Russian oil and gas, the harshest economic penalty yet imposed. The bloc notably will be reducing its direct funding of the Russian budget. The EU paid 44 billion euros over 2 months for Russian energy, whereas the monthly average payment stood at 12 billion euros last year. The oil embargo, however, may lead to gasoline shortages later this year and heighten already steep inflation. In the first 4 months of 2022, Russia's current account surplus was $96 billion or more than triple the same period in 2011. Due to the EU's partial oil ban, the cost of crude oil on global markets has further soared. Russia has generally encountered relatively few difficulties in finding alternative markets for its energy as well. However, a full-scale orientation to Asia faces significant hurdles, with new infrastructure taking years to build and challenges in locating ships, banks, and insurers.
What about you, Mr. Stephen Hall here? The Nord Stream 1 pipeline, Germany's main source of Russian gas, is scheduled to be out of action until July 21st for routine work that the operator says includes testing of mechanical elements and automation systems. Analysts also say that a complete shutdown of supplies could tip Germany into a recession with an economic slump of around 5%. How do you read this overall?
I think that certainly Russia is playing hardball. As you would expect, it knows that the European countries are still reliant on it primarily for gas and oil. It's still the biggest market for the EU, and the EU does not have or hasn't been able yet, of course, to find other sources, although it certainly is working on this. We see with Bulgaria talking with Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan as well. But that will take time. And so Russia has the capacity at the moment to try and blackmail the European countries into finding a solution. They honestly believe, as we see in what Putin and various other people in the Russian government have said, that Ukraine is but a pawn. Obviously, America is on top of the pyramid, as it were. The EU and Germany, specifically in France to a lesser extent, are below America, and they can force Ukraine into finding a negotiated settlement on Russia's terms. And I think this is certainly something that Russia is trying to do, going above Ukraine to what it believes are the second tier in this pyramid that can then enforce Ukraine into a pro-Russian settlement of the conflict.
And in another development, an unsettling military buildup is occurring along Ukraine's border with Belarus. Russian soldiers and weaponry are reportedly waiting and ready to launch a new front against Ukraine in Belarus. According to Western intelligence services, this would put a significant strain on Kiev's defenses. So back to you, Mr. Peter Militunovic. Do you believe that Russia could possibly send its forces through Belarus in the case of a broad invasion, effectively stretching out Ukraine's defenses by taking advantage of the two countries' nearly 700-mile border?
Well, actually, nobody wants an actual conflict with the Russians. The European Union, United States, and NATO are content that this will remain a proxy conflict. In the European Union, actually, there are no meaningful military capabilities whatsoever that can deter the Russians, especially within the European Common Security and Defense Policy. But of course, the major way to deter the potential invasion of Russian troops from the Belarusian territory are the sanctions. The damage of the sanctions has mostly been actually borne by the Western economy and Western consumers whose energy bills have raised. And with that, the energy inflation ends up affecting every other sphere of business. Meanwhile, the autocratic governments actually tend to like sanctions. They concentrate more on the domestic production. Therefore, they become more autonomous, less dependent on external powers. And actually, the rich classes tend to inject more money back into the economy. But actually, the major beneficiary from these sanctions that the European Union can only impose to deter the Russian advancement on the territory are actually most beneficial to the Russian Federation.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Professor Stephen Hall? Do you think that Belarus would play a serious role in the conflict if Russia were to launch an all-out attack on Ukraine?
I mean, I could be very badly wrong, and I hope I'm not, but I don't believe that Russia will invade through Belarus. It just needs to keep on getting the Belarusian army to do training exercises on the border. And we see this in the Brest region today, that the Belarusian army has extended its training exercise for, I think, the fourth time since the conflict began. And this ties down Ukrainian forces in the north. Ukraine cannot afford to, whilst it doesn't believe that the Belarusians or the Russians would invade, it cannot take that risk. And so there will always be Ukrainian soldiers on the northern border. It's 700 kilometers long, they have to be there. And that ties a certain number of Ukrainian soldiers to the north, which makes it harder for them to be redeployed to the east and to the south to help with the defense against the Russian army. Russia is using Belarusian space in terms of sending missiles and attack aircraft, but I don't think at the moment we will see a mobilization of Belarusian and Russian forces. We have seen in the past that Belarusian partisans have attacked the railway tracks, and that's why the Belarusian regime has had to increase the death penalty for people who now sabotage railway tracks. And we also know that Lukashenko has had to stand a fine line. He's talked about the militarization, a great history of the military in Belarus, but at the same time, he's always talking about peaceful Belarus because he knows the majority of the population simply do not support the war and would not want to see Belarusians involved in the war against what they perceive as a brotherly nation in regards to Ukraine. There is, of course, this three Slavic triangle, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, and for most Belarusians, they are all brothers. So fighting with one brother against another would not look good.
Very nice. And in another development, Russian Foreign Ministry said that the United States and its allies are putting the world on the brink of a nuclear war. This came in a statement by the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, this morning on the ministry's website, where she said Washington and its allies, after exacerbating the Ukrainian crisis and unleashing a hybrid fierce confrontation with Russia, are vacillating today. It is on the brink of an open military confrontation with our country, which means a direct armed conflict with nuclear powers. Mr. Peter Militonovich, I get back to you. Zakharova expressed her concern that such a potential clash would be fraught with nuclear escalation. How likely is this?
Well, as I've mentioned previously, most major powers are content that this remains a proxy war. So a nuclear scenario is unlikely. Russia and Ukraine currently have nothing to offer each other that could support peace talks to halt the war by providing this kind of rhetoric. Actually, it seems to me that this is a way to deter further escalation of violence. A starting point in strategically preparing for negotiation talks is to envision a structure for negotiations that offers each side a chance to bargain for something it wants. In many wars, an aggressive belligerent like Russia that needs to be brought into a peace process may require expanding the field for negotiations beyond the issues that trigger the hostilities. So a way to draw Vladimir Putin into eventual peace talks and also into negotiating over his control over Ukrainian territory will be to offer him actually the chance to bargain directly with the United States over his broader complaints. Essentially, this will mean a negotiation over what Putin thinks is Russia's unfair marginalization as a great power and the security and economic threats to Russia of expanding NATO and EU strategic influence. Indeed, some have argued against most evidence that a root of the conflict lies not in Ukraine, but in the Russian desire for a reform of the European security architecture, and however, a viable peace process that creates a path for Ukraine to seek a recovery of territory seized by Russian arms will need to include these two elements. So they will need to broaden a peace process beyond simply Russia.
But how likely is this
negotiations.
peace process, Mr. Peter Militonovic, since we see that the West are still sending this military support that is rubbing Russia the wrong way on the one hand, and of course we see Russia determined not to let go of the occupied territories, which is against Ukraine's wish to have a peace talk?
Well, it seems to me so there are two elements that need to be fulfilled. As I mentioned, there is a need to expand the field for negotiations beyond the issues that triggered the hostilities. So there's a need to broaden a peace process beyond Russia-Ukraine negotiations to include a separate negotiation that includes Europe and NATO. So to encourage Russia to make difficult concessions to Ukraine, notably a withdrawal from territories Russia has seized in war, the peace process should proceed simultaneously on three levels. Russia-Ukraine talks would address their bilateral disputes. Secondly, Russian talks with the European Union and Ukraine would aim to reset their relations, disrupted since 2014, and seek agreement on economic and security arrangements for countries like Ukraine that lie between Russia and the EU. So, given the failures of earlier diplomacy involving the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to resolve the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it will be necessary to reform that organization, re-establish it as a long-term confidence building measure to prevent future regional conflicts. Finally, a Russia talks with NATO and the United States would take up issues of strategic stability and the US-Russia relationship in the world order. So while some would argue that broadening the negotiations would just reward Putin for his use of force, only this full combination of negotiations, equal and interlocking might, and tints him into making concessions to Ukraine.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Professor Stephen Hall? Do you agree that uncertainties are abound, including how much and what types of military support the West will continue to offer Ukraine, and how much popular support will remain in Western countries for devoting significant resources to backing Ukraine amid the growing public fatigue over the war and its economic repercussions on the average Western citizens? And we have in UK an example seeing the collapse of the government and the support to Ukraine seems not to continue. How do you read all this?
Well, I'll go back to start with the British government. It doesn't matter, in my humble opinion, as to who is in power in Britain. They will always support Ukraine. They will, even if it was a change in government. So if Labour was to come to power, it would still be the supporting Ukraine. That will not change. Britain's relationship with Russia has always been antagonistic, and that support for Ukraine will always be there. In terms of the economic issues, certainly we will, and we are possibly starting to see fatigue. But again, I will bring you to a poll that was conducted yesterday in America, where 70% of Americans, even though they were told you will be poorer this year, still support Ukraine against Russia. They know that there is going to be a lot of economic hardship for them. And I think this is the case across Europe and across the West. So I don't think that public opinion is going to change. I don't think governments in the West are going to change. And I don't think that there will be negotiations. I would like to see that this would be the case, but I simply don't believe that Putin or the Russian regime wants negotiations. They will eventually say that we've done the demilitarization and denazification, but ultimately they are looking for some sort of regime change, some sort of suzerainty in Kiev. And I think it would be a terrible mistake, personally, if America and Russia were to sit, or Russia was to get to talk to America as equals in this current situation, or to Europe, and to try and negotiate a new architecture. Russia's been talking about this since the 1990s, and no matter when NATO has tried to create NATO-Russia councils, when NATO has tried to talk to Russia, Russia has always been intransigent. And I honestly don't think that this would set a particularly good precedent if America was to sit down, let's say in Helsinki or Riga or wherever, and talk to Russia as an equal and say, yes, we're going to change the entire European security structures. because of what you've just done in Ukraine. That would set a terrible precedent, and certainly I personally think would allow Putin to think the West really is weak. And it would also say, if you're going to take away NATO and the right to protection of all NATO members, then it doesn't stop Putin from going into the Baltics. I don't personally think he will if NATO is there, but without NATO, there is a real problem, because Russia will continually keep on coming up with reasons why it is upset, regardless of whether you have NATO on the one hand or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on the other. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you so much, dear guest, for your thorough analysis. We have reached the end of our special coverage. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. We have reached the end. Bye for now.